It's the beginning of the school year. Teachers are returning, and there are new children in our classrooms. And one of the first things we like to do is get to know each other with icebreakers. So we ask questions like, what did you do over the summer? And when it comes to work, are you an early bird or a night owl? And then there's my favorite. If you could have any superpower, what would it be and why? I always say that I choose the ability to speak any language on the planet so that I can travel with no barriers to communication. And now you know something about me. Now imagine it's a couple weeks later. Things are a bit more difficult. You're having a hard time balancing lesson planning and grading, and you're feeling a little alone in your classroom. Does knowing my superpower make you feel more comfortable coming and talking to me about it? Probably not. And that's okay because I wouldn't either. See, we all want to work in a positive environment with colleagues we know we can lean on for support when the time comes. But knowing our favorite foods and pet names and trying to guess our two truths and a lie isn't going to get us there. Instead of just breaking the ice, we need to challenge ourselves to go deeper. We can't just be acquaintances. We really need to have relationships. And I saw this firsthand with the sixth grade group of students that I advised 3 years ago. At the beginning of the year, I filled our time with icebreakers in hopes that as we got closer to one another, we could have more serious conversations about family and school and identity. But as the shift to those more serious conversations started, I watched in disappointment and sadness and honestly a bit of fear as my students pulled more and more away from me each week. In hindsight, I realized I didn't have the strong relationships with my students that I thought I did. And even more, they didn't have it with each other. And when I asked, why wasn't anybody willing to speak up? One of my students said, well, I don't know them, so I don't trust them. And I knew that also meant they didn't trust me either. But we already knew each other's favorite ice cream flavors and how many siblings we had and our favorite songs and artists. So I didn't have much more to go off of except, how was your week? And that's where we started. We sat in a circle and did the simplest thing I could think of. We shared one high and one low for the week. And as my students shared their stories, what I started to notice is that they were actually now resonating with one another about real life events and experiences. They shared their excitement for their weekend plans because there was a new movie coming out or a festival coming into town. They shared their misery over how hard the math test was that week and their nervousness about how they performed on that math test because if they didn't do well, they couldn't be in the basketball game or in the step show. The more stories that were shared, the more my students found validation and connection with each other. This is when they finally started to trust each other. And eventually, our conversations weren't just about our highs and our lows. We started to discuss deeper topics like, how do you know who your true friends are? And my sixth graders were asking, why is it sometimes hard to be the person you want to be in school versus who others say you should be? With how great this was working out with my students, I started to naturally wonder, why aren't the adults in my building spending time doing the same thing when what we want is the same support systems that I now saw with my students? My curiosity led me to a training with the Center for Restorative Justice, where the practice of using circles to share stories has been done with great result. Simply put, you can't mend relationships that have gone wrong if you can't build authentic relationships from the start. And it was at this training that I recognized just how important it was to be more vulnerable with my colleagues. That instead of knowing my fun facts, they should know things like, why did I decide to become a teacher? And what are the values that I carry in my life? And how does that impact me in the classroom? My colleagues should know my educational journey. That way they can better understand my perspective on education today. The truth is, that we can't feel comfortable trusting a person until we know that person. And in order to know a person, you need to know the stories behind them. After years of advocating to do circles with my staff, I finally got the opportunity at my current school. And since August, my staff has spent hours together in circles, building a foundation of trust and support. From those efforts, I see them more willingly diving into conversations that are critical around race and the challenges of maintaining high expectations for all students. When we work on building these relationships, it allows our staff to actually start to be vulnerable with one another. And this is the power of circles, and this is the power of sharing stories. When we ask questions that reveal our stories, we create the opportunity to find connection. And in doing so, we get to create we get to create the positive environment that we all want and truthfully need. Now, undoubtedly, some of you are in here thinking, okay, I hear you, Chrissy, but I don't know about all this vulnerability thing with my colleagues. It's just not my thing. Or some of you are excited to share, but with everything that teachers have going on, you're thinking, we just don't have time for this. So let me tell you how it works. We sit in a circle, we ask really thoughtful questions, and we pass around an object to serve as a talking piece to ensure every voice is heard. Low on time? Ask just one question. Uncomfortable being vulnerable? Lean into it gradually like my students did. The reality is, of course we don't have the time, which is why we can't waste it doing the things we know don't work. Instead, we need to substitute out all those superficial get-to-know-you activities and questions with the ones that actually build relationships. And yes, this also means that I'm inviting you to embrace the discomfort of being vulnerable because it's needed in order to build trust. So let me tell you a vulnerable story about me. It's the why I chose to switch from being a pre-med major to the teacher standing in front of you today. When I was a sophomore in college, I was chosen as a mentor for a sophomore student in high school. It was through a program centered on helping Latino youth access higher education. Helping my mentee Liz become the first person in her family to go to college was special to me because I too was a first-generation college student and knew the challenges of navigating the college application process. So when Liz's senior year came, we were ready because we had spent 3 years preparing for it. Halfway through the first application, unfortunately, our hopes and excitement started to fade away because that's when we discovered Liz's citizenship status and realized that she no longer had the same opportunities and resources available to her that her peers did. Our journey from that point on was so much more difficult, but me and Liz figured it out together. And through that relationship and experience, my passion for educational equity and social justice was ignited. I remember literally the next week finally sitting down with the Teach for America recruiter and saying, okay, let's give this teaching thing a go. And I've been in the classroom ever since. And by sharing this story with you, you now know something more about me than just my fun fact of the superpower I want. This story shows you that relationships have always been at the core of what drives me as an educator. And it shows you that maybe we share the similar hopes and concerns that for our students that you do. And that we probably share similar passions, which is what has brought us here together in the first place. When given the opportunity, it is this story that I choose to share with my colleagues at the beginning of the school year. Because that way, if the time came, your response could be slightly different when asked, do you feel comfortable coming and talking to me now? Thank you.